All right, welcome back to the Centerpoint YouTube channel where we're continuing our discussion on apologetics. Last week we talked about a few examples of was Jesus even real or was he a myth? And we're going to be continuing looking at the historical evidence for Jesus in this episode. So Vince, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so we're just going to be going through some of the third-party external sources of Jesus's life, accounts of Jesus's life that are not really from the Bible or from Christian sources, right? So the first one that we have here is Tacitus, and he writes, there's this little section in here where he says, consequently, to rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators. Is that it? Procurators? I'll say it's that.
I'd say so.
Pontius Pilate. So that's there's this little section that Tacitus writes, and what can we gather from this? Well, you know, this is not the Bible. This is a third-party source, and he's writing that, you know, Christus did actually exist. So, you know, last week we talked about in mythicism that, oh, you know, there's these people that say Jesus didn't exist. He's just an amalgamation of all of these old, dying, and rising gods, and they just kind of piece stuff together. But here we actually do have third-party evidence that says, no, he really did actually exist. And he really was killed by Pontius Pilate. And then that extreme penalty that this is referring to is probably referring to the crucifixion. And then it actually puts him in the right time frame. He did really exist in Pontius Pilate's reign. So that whole, you know, that whole story of Jesus being crucified by Pontius Pilate, you know, this is evidence that, hey, that actually did happen. And it also shows that the early church really was persecuted. You know, we see some of that in the book of Acts, but really this is talking about later in Nero's reign. So you can see
that's kind of what we're going to be doing in this episode is, like we said, really no scholar takes the mythicism view. And these are some of the reasons why, in addition to the Bible.
Yep.
So I believe there's another quote after this, if we can go there. There's several. So this is from Pliny, who says, they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses of a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust which they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So from this, we could see there's evidence that Jesus' followers worshipped him as God, and this isn't proof that he was God. That's actually something we're going to be talking about in the next episode when we look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. But it at least is consistent with the claims that he made in the Bible that he was God manifest in the flesh. And this is also evidence for his teachings. So Jesus taught a lot of these things in the Bible, and now we have a third-party source saying that, hey, Jesus' followers did these things. They committed to not committing fraud, theft, or adultery. So it was something he taught and his disciples practiced.
Yep. So continuing on, one of the major sources of third-party evidence that we have for Jesus would be Josephus. Now, there's what's called the Testimonium Flavianum, or whatever. This little section has its own name in the Latin, as you can see. And now this portion is very controversial, right, of Josephus. There's actually two passages that Josephus has that directly talk about Jesus. This is the first one, and let's go ahead and read it. It says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to a cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them again alive the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold, and these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So you can see, boy, this is a really glowing review of Jesus. And Josephus is actually a Jewish historian. And this is not something you would expect to hear from a Jewish historian. He was the Messiah. Well really, a Jew believes that he was the Messiah. That's hard to, and he says, oh, these wonderful things he's done. He really did rise on the third day and all this stuff. This is, most scholars reject this as an interpolation. And what that means is that people have gone back to what Josephus wrote down and inserted stuff. So you could see this is, in my eyes, this is clearly Christians going back into Josephus. Who knows what this passage really was before they wrote down and padded it out with all this wonderful Christian speaking. But,
There's that core of truth in there is what scholars would say, though. At least Jesus existed and was crucified.
Yes, he probably wrote down something like that. There was a man named Jesus. He was crucified by Pilate. Who knows? Something like, nobody can really know what he wrote down, but this is definitely not what Josephus wrote down.
Here's another writing from Josephus, much more modest. So he says, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. When they had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So again, from this passage, much more modest, not as much of a glowing review. Yeah, it's reasonable here. Yeah. Christ existed, refers to the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. So this is evidence not only for Jesus's existence, but also his brother, James. And the epistle of James is attributed to Jesus's brother. So now we have evidence that James was a real historical figure. Mm-hmm. And also it talks about the persecution of the early church that we read a lot about in the book of Acts. So again, these things are all coming together as a third-party source for a lot of these events.
And so whenever someone says, I heard one time someone say, oh, you can't trust anything Josephus, you can't trust that Josephus wrote down and all that. And yeah, that's right. That one passage, wouldn't trust it. This one, much more modest, much more reasonable. Just wrote down what happened. Yep, James' brother, Jesus, got stoned to death. There you go. So then we have this other letter that was written by Mara bar Serapion, I'll say. And
it works for me.
It works, yeah. So he's writing a letter to his son. And he's kind of waxing poetic about 3 men that died. And as you can see, he's writing it down like these are actual things that really did happen. These men lived and they really died and bad things happened. So he says this, what else can we say? When the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, their wisdom is captured by insults and their minds are oppressed and without defense? Question mark. Okay, what advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, and now I've got to kind of move there we go. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down. So, he never really explicitly names Jesus, but I don't know who else this could even be close to attributed to. It's talking about the king of the Jews who was killed by the Jews. So clearly, I think that he's obviously referring to a really great, wise teachers. This is on the level of Socrates and Pythagoras. Yeah, maybe there were some other Christ-like people who might have claimed to be Christ, to the Jews or whatever, but none of them were nearly considered as influential in that time as Jesus. So this clearly portrays Jesus killed by the Jews, and also Jesus is talking about laying down a new law. So there's some things that we can gather from that he did exist, because he's talking about these three guys and they all did exist. So he's talking about them as if they really did exist. And he was killed by the Jews, which comports with the Bible accounts of the Jews trying to crucify Christ and Pontius allowing it, was referred to as a wise king, even by outsiders. This guy is not a Christian. Some people think he's just a pagan, or clearly he believes in God at some level, because he says God brought justice to these men, but he's not thought to be a Christian by historians. And he's referred to as a wise king, which comports with his claims to be a king. In John 18, he really did claim to be a king. And also that he establishes a new law, and that's what Jesus came, to establish a new law, a new covenant. So all of this is pretty good evidence that what Jesus was saying, claiming to be king, really, that really did happen, and people really did, think and see him as a king, or at least a claimed king.
Yeah, and here's one more from another source. So this is from Suetonius. I'm just going to read the first part for sake of time. It says, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. So again, this is talking about the fact that there's the persecution of the early church, this punishment inflicted on the Christians, and that they'd given in to this new way of living, right? Which we've talked about a lot from these other sources, and of course we'd read in the Bible. So Vince, why don't you sum this up?
Yep. So just looking at this selection of third-party sources about Jesus, the historical figure of Jesus, we can gather this evidence. There's actually more. There's other things as well, kind of minor, but we can gather that Christ did actually exist. He was crucified. He was killed by Pontius Pilate, and also, it's funny, even as a Christian, just if someone asks you the question, who killed Jesus? Was it Pontius Pilate or the Jews? You're like, yes. Both. And that's what the historical evidence points to as well. Pontius Pilate, he was killed under Pontius Pilate and by the Jews. And he died sometime in the reign of Pontius Pilate. There was persecution in the early church. He's referred to as a wise king, even by outsiders, which comports to him claiming to be king. He establishes a new law. His brother, not only did Jesus exist, but his brother also did exist, which is in the Bible as well. And that his followers did worship him as God, as he claimed to be God. And that a lot of his teachings were really preserved. A lot of the stuff that you see in the Sermon on the Mount, the third-party sources, right? Yeah, they were following these things, and you look at it like, oh, wow, that really matches up with a lot of what Jesus taught, and oh, yeah, a lot of these sources are saying, yeah, he brought about a new law or something. That's what Jesus, was teaching in the Bible. So,
yeah, and that's what we're going to be examining. Not so much next week. So this is third-party evidence that Jesus existed and then he made these claims. So next week we want to really examine, were these claims true? His claims of being God, and that's where we're going to be looking at the historical evidence for the resurrection.
Yep.
So thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.